You had this video that played that I think raised a lot of eyebrows.
New technologies to observe and track human thoughts. Professor Nita Farahany.
Steve, that's a professor at Duke University, Nita Farahany.
Nita Farahany, and she says that these technologies already exist.
But the idea that actual neurological activity could be interceded is extraordinary.
I am not ready for what they are now calling brain transparency. It's here. Don't dismiss this. It's here.
It's not going to be good for you. You're not going to be leaning back, relaxing, querying what your brainwaves meant. You're going to be in prison.
Well, that little segment got picked up, right, and shared literally hundreds of millions of times. For people who've never been thinking about neurotechnology, who've never been exposed to neurotechnology, who didn't even know that the world of wearable brain technology is developing, I think it's just so incredibly disconcerting for people that having it in a 2.5-minute video like that was, gobsmacking for most people.
So Nita, thanks so much for joining me here on Techforpsych. I've been doing this for a while now, taking a look at these wearable devices for the last 10 years. And these concerns have come up in the past where people have talked about fears about this technology being able to read your mind and do even sci-fi things like mind control. And I always felt like it was way cart before the horse, way down the line, nothing that we really need to worry about. But it seems like the tide has changed lately. And I think your book is a big place marker for that. And these issues that you're raising are very important. So if you could just please introduce yourself. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was this presentation you did at the World Economic Forum, where you had this video that played that I think raised a lot of eyebrows and even went viral on TikTok because people are starting to wake up to the fact that these technologies are becoming more prominent.
Yeah. So I'm Nita Farahany. I am a professor of law and philosophy at Duke University, where I'm also the founding director of the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. And I'm a neuroethicist, somebody who focuses on the ethics of emerging technologies, and really have spent probably the past decade with a deep dive in neurotech, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. I gave a presentation on my forthcoming book, The Battle for Your Brain, Defending the Right to Think Freely in the Age of Neurotechnology, at the World Economic Forum at Davos this year. So I was doing a deep dive at Davos just in chapter 2 of my book, which is Your Brain at Work. And as I was talking to the conference organizers, I said, it's hard to do just chapter 2, which is Your Brain at Work, without giving people a broader context of both what the book is about, but also the broader vision. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. There are risks that people don't realize about how the technology could be used. And so as we were brainstorming it, I said, well, and it was a short talk. It was 30 minutes total for questions and answers and everything. I said, what if I did something unusual? What if I took this little scenario that I wrote for the introduction of my book, which just tries to encapsulate the full spectrum of what a lot of the issues are that are grappled with in the book. And what if I had that animated and just played that 2.5 minutes at the beginning of my talk, just to give people sort of a context before diving in. And they said, that sounds great. And so I reached out to an animator, and he animated that 2.5 minutes. And I started the talk by showing the 2.5-minute video. And then I got up and I said, is this a world that you're all ready for? Believe it or not, it's based on technology that's already here today that could make any of these things possible. That's not actually what's happening, right? But that's a world in which it's imaginable based on existing technology. Well, that little segment got picked up, right, and shared literally hundreds of millions of times at this point on TikTok and in other venues. And I think people, because they saw just that 2.5 minutes out of context, they thought I was advocating for that being the future, right? Which is like, this is what I think is great. So they didn't even recognize it was a dystopian scenario, probably because of the animation or something. Right. This is what we're trying to safeguard against, not this is a future that I'm advocating for. So I think it did wake people up. I think the combination of both the video, which is startling to think about that could be the future, but then also me saying, hey, this is technology that has already made this kind of a scenario possible. For people who've never been thinking about neurotechnology, who've never been exposed to neurotechnology, who didn't even know that the world of wearable brain technology is developing, I think it's just so incredibly disconcerting for people that having it in a 2.5-minute video like that was, gobsmacking for most people.
Yeah. And I wonder if we could take the larger context into account. Do you think that this is because people are starting to have fears about AI and other types of technology that become very in the mainstream consciousness as of late because of ChatGPT and other related programs?
Yeah, I would like to better understand why it touched such a nerve that it did. I think probably part of it is this fear of AI. Part of it is that people are starting to wake up to the ways in which data is being commodified and how much privacy truly is at risk. And then I think the last is that most people, maybe not you and I, because we've been looking at and thinking about consumer neurotechnology for a very long time, they just imagined that the brain was this sacred black box that could never be decoded, that nothing could ever be gleaned from it. And the idea that it could be in the form of our earbuds, right, picking up brain activity, and the fact that brain activity could be decoded at all and then accessed by other people, not just by oneself. I think confronting people with that when they don't even know the existence of the technology or the capabilities of what has been happening in neuroscience to make it possible to decode brain activity, at least to some extent. I think the combination of all of those things, plus the fact that it was at the World Economic Forum, which I didn't realize for many people already is a frightening space, because they believe that a lot of decisions about the world and a lot of control and kind of domination of the world is happening there at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I think the combination of all of those things really just deeply touched a nerve for the uninitiated to what's happening in this space.
Yeah. And to us that have been watching this industry for a while, it's kind of the logical next step, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think it's not that startling for most people who have been following the industry for a while, but for somebody who's never heard about anything happening in this space, I think it was just a startling introduction.
And how did you first get into neurotech and tracking its progression over time? And what have you noticed in terms of when you first started looking at it compared to now and how far it's come?
Yeah, so I got into it by way of behavioral genetics. So I was very passionate about the ways in which behavioral genetics could be used in the criminal justice system and were being used in the criminal justice system. That's actually why I went to grad school, was to study the intersection of behavioral sciences together with the US criminal justice system. And it quickly became apparent to me that behavioral genetics, as interesting as it was not nearly as likely to raise the complex questions that I was asking as neuroscience was. And so I started looking at all of the ways in which neuroscience was already being used in the criminal justice system, from mostly criminal defendants coming in and saying, my brain made me do it. Here are the scans that I've had done. And it was, not consumer wearables. These were functional magnetic resonance imaging or even EEG, but it was clinical grade EEG where they were having studies done looking at brain abnormalities or differences that would help to, explain things like frontotemporal dementia. But as I started to do that and started to think about not just the ways in which it was being used, but in the ways in which it could be used, I became very interested in both some of the early applications in the criminal justice system, primarily the use by the likes of people like Larry Farwell, who had developed the P300 kind of probe as a way to interrogate criminal suspects or terrorists or things like that. I became very interested in the possibility of that technology. And at the time, most of the neuroscientists and leaders in the field who I would talk with dismissed most of what he was doing and most of the technology to say, look, this is all just noise. We're not picking up much brain activity from these devices. The sensors aren't particularly good. The placement of them at home is so different person to person that the likelihood of this ever becoming mainstream is quite limited. And, given that most of the devices frankly look a little bit silly, right? I mean, most of us are not going around with, forehead bands. I saw that as a significant limiting factor in how likely it was to go mainstream. But as I tracked it over time, and I think especially it's really the combination of advances in AI, I think that have been the most profound, but also the advances in engineering that have enabled, the miniaturization of electrodes, more universal placement at home, better integration with software that can test the fit and how good the responsiveness is. All of those advances, but especially the extraordinary advances in AI on training data and the ability to filter out noise and to pick up better and more information, I think transformed over time. And we're going to talk in a moment about control labs as the kind of pivotal moment. But the thing that really, I think the combination of all of those things, but then once people in neurotech started to recognize, okay, if we're wearing heart rate sensors and we're wearing, movement and motion trackers and GPS trackers, and those are embedded into our multifunctional devices, why not embed brain sensors into multifunctional devices? That's the moment to me that it was like, okay, everything has gotten better in the ability to both pick up brain activity and to decode it. But once you figure out the form factor, that's the deciding factor about what makes it go mainstream.
Yeah, I was curious. We talked about how it was perceived on social media for people that are not very familiar with these technologies. But I was curious what your interactions with people at the World Economic Forum, as well as other professionals, whether that be neuroscientists, doctors, or people in law, like is the general consensus that they're starting to see the possibilities, or are they just completely new to it? Or what have you experienced in the last year or two in speaking to professionals one-on-one about where this is headed?
Neuroscientists are like, yeah, of course, right? I mean, some of them still dismiss it, especially, I know a lot of people in the BCI world who are working on implanted neurotechnology, right? And I think they still look at most of this stuff as noisy, not particularly high fidelity, picking up a few surface, kind of patterns, which are not going to give that much depth of information, particularly compared to implanted electrodes. That's all true, right? I mean, that the difference between wearable neurotechnology, even the most advanced, versus implanted neurotechnology with thousands of electrodes deeper into the brain, there's no comparison. But the people who I spoke with in both developing the book, but also who I had do early reviews of the book, are very serious neuroscientists, right? I mean, these are the leaders in the field who were all like, yeah, this is fair and accurate and the direction that it's going. Let's set them aside for a moment, which I would say is the experts. The folks who I encounter in everyday life, who I'm telling most of this to, their first encounter with it oftentimes is in conversation with me. And I think for most people, they're incredulous at first and then terrified. It's the combination of the two. It's like, I see this arc every time, which is like, really? Can it actually do any of that? And then they start to freak out as they go to the worst possible place with this, right? And it's hard to really help people see the difference between, you can pick up states of mind and general categories and patterns. It's not literally decoding the complex thoughts in your mind. That, I think, is something more familiar to people within the field about what those distinctions are. It's harder to convey that nuance and meaning to people who aren't within the field. But I'd say the starting place of like most media that I talk to about it is they just want me to like demonstrate the devices. They want like a show and tell as to, what it is and what you can do. And I'm like, no, I've written a book about the ethics of it. Should we talk about that part? And they're like, yeah, but can you show me the devices and what they do? Right. So I think it's fascination. It's a combination of fascination and terror. And it's usually that arc. It's initially fascination, and then they quickly see how disastrous that could be in the wrong hands and used in the wrong ways.
Yeah, which brings us to the next talking point that I wanted to ask you about is that Columbia University published this 5 neuro rights: the right to mental privacy, personal identity, free will, equal access to mental augmentation, and protection against algorithmic bias. How important is establishing these ideas, these neuro rights at this stage when this industry is just in its infancy of entering our everyday lives?
So first, I think it's fantastic that that group has been at the forefront of developing a platform of principles to think about the use of neurotechnology. I take a different approach. And so I'll start with what the kind of difference of my approach is, and then explain why I still think that's a really useful set of talking points. So I take a different approach. I'm a lawyer, right, as a starting place and a law professor. And so I'm taking it from, I think, a more rights-based approach and a more rooted in existing law approach. So the approach that I'm taking is to advocate for something called the right to cognitive liberty. And the right to cognitive liberty is the right to self-determination over our brains and mental experiences. It's a narrower concept and also a broader concept. So it's narrower in the sense that what I really am advocating for is an international right to cognitive liberty, which requires updating 3 existing international human rights. That's updating our right to freedom of thought to be interpreted more expansively. It's primarily been understood as a right that protects freedom of religion. And freedom of thought really should include the right to not have our thoughts decoded by other people, used against us, and manipulated by other people, punished for what we're thinking. The right to mental privacy is, we have an existing international right to privacy, but the right to mental privacy, while that might be implicit, it isn't explicit in the way that that right has been interpreted. And so I think that right needs to be interpreted to include explicitly a right to mental privacy, but privacy, if you get into the details of it, is what we call relative right. We balance societal interest against individual interest. It's not an absolute protection against anybody peering into your brain. And so the overlap between freedom of thought and mental privacy is really important. Freedom of thought protects the kind of complex thinking that people are really worried about. Mental privacy would say, well, sometimes maybe doing something like being able to decode fatigue levels from the brain might be okay if you're a commercial pilot and that's the only thing that we're detecting. By contrast, self-determination is a positive right. What that means is we ought to have a right to be able to access technology, to access information about our own brains, to be able to do things like engage in cognitive enhancement or even cognitive diminishment, if that's something that makes sense for us. That's a little different. Well, it's a lot different than the principles that have been outlined by Columbia. So the principles that they've outlined, some of which overlap with international human rights laws, really get it kind of from their perspective, a broad set of principles about how we ought to be thinking about this space, right? Things like equal access to augmentation. That's a normative claim, right? Which is that everybody ought to have equal access to technology. We could say that about a lot of different technologies. I think we'd have to explain like what is special about this one to have a special right to equal access to technology in this space compared to, for example, your right to everybody having access to a cell phone or generative AI, right? If you thought about neuro rights really broadly in that conception, like what does mental augmentation mean? And does that mean that everybody has equal access to education and everybody has equal access to, right, the same level of education, the same exposure to music, the same exposure to so many different things? Similarly, the right against algorithmic discrimination, that's not unique to the brain, right? That's a concern that you would look at really broadly across many different dimensions. And so I think outlining principles that you think matter when it comes to the brain makes sense. Those aren't rights in the traditional way that a lawyer or a law professor would think of rights. Rights would be rooted in the way that I've described it. And so I think what they've described is from their perspective, a normative set of principles that ought to govern how we think about the brain. Whether we need to do all of that in advance of neurotechnology, I don't think so. I think that's a kind of ongoing societal conversation. I do think we need the right to cognitive liberty now and immediately, and that we need that now and immediately because it's the default rule that we need as we are rolling out the technology. A default right to cognitive liberty would flip protections to put them in favor of individuals rather than corporate rights to commodification of brain data, for example. It would govern the use of the technology going forward. And it would be pretty easy to do because the updating of those existing rights doesn't require, a bunch of governments to come together and actively recognize and pass it. It simply requires the Human Rights Committee that oversees what's called the ICCPR, the treaty that implements the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to recognize that there is the right to cognitive liberty and direct the updating of those existing rights by interpretation.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think this is all happening actually a lot quicker than people understand. We talked a little bit about the probing that they can do with neurotechnology, as far as almost like a lie detector test for criminal type activities. But one of the things that struck me from your book was this ability to track attention during the day. You've got fatigue issues when it comes to train conductors or pilots. But one of the things that really struck my attention was this ability to track attention. You can track central, peripheral, and distracted attention. Could you talk about that a little bit and what that means for what the workplace of the future might look like, and what important employee handbooks or other types of rules need to be established before people feel like they're being taken advantage by companies that are tracking their attention throughout the day, which has already sort of happened in like warehouses with Amazon, with tracking break times, that type of thing. So
yeah, it's a great question. So first we should just distinguish, right? I mean, technology in individual hands can be empowering for people. When other people are using that same technology as a means of surveillance or as a means of, control of other people, it totally changes the dynamic of what the technology can do and how useful it is. So one thing that many employers have been trying to do, especially since the pandemic began and remote work started to happen much more frequently, is they've been very interested in trying to track attention and focus during the workday. There was a deep suspicion by many bosses that people working from home were distracted most of the time, weren't paying attention at work, were doing things like, hanging out at home rather than actually working. So they started to implement a lot of technology to track even what we call white collar workers, people who are working at computers all day instead of in warehouses. And that includes everything from keystroke logging to even really intrusive things like turning on webcams that are work issued webcams to take screenshots of a person at their work, or screenshots of what's on their computer screen throughout the workday to see if you're, surfing social media or if you are, working on code or documentation or whatever other, kind of workplace memo you were supposed to be working on. So in that environment, launching neurotechnology has become also something that has happened in a number of workplaces. And here again, what employers are trying to figure out is the extent to which an employee is paying attention or their mind is wandering, if they're focused, and not just at a particular moment in time, but as workplaces have started to shift to more hybrid environments, trying to figure out if people are more focused for longer periods of time at home or in the office. And so tracking brain metrics to be able to see whether a person is paying attention, for how long they're paying attention, and then compare it from a home environment to a work environment in the office, for example, has become something that some workplaces have started to do through neurotechnology. And, my initial look at all of that was like, okay, but so what? Because you can't tell if I'm paying attention to Facebook or paying attention to my memo. And when you combine it with the fact that work issued computers enable them to have all of this so-called bossware, where not only are you tracking brain metrics, but you're tracking what's on their computer screen, that's already startling, right? They can get very precise information. But then I started to look at some of the research that has come out in other places using EEG activity of attention, and saw this interesting study funded out of Bavaria, where they were able to use EEG, just brainwave data, and differentiate between whether or not a person was paying attention to a central, peripheral, or unrelated task. And by that, what they meant was, a person who was focused on like code, documentation of that code, or something like surfing social media. And they could use brainwave data to actually just differentiate between those different environments that was up on a computer screen. So, that suggests to me that we're getting better and better at the ability to use just EEG data and be able to discriminate between whether a person is paying attention or their mind is wandering, and not only whether they're paying attention or their mind is wandering, but what they're paying attention to. And I should, so that's the kind of descriptive side of it. The normative side of it is, I don't think that's a helpful thing for employers to be doing in any way, shape, or form. I think giving people the tools to be able to track their attention and focus can be helpful. Like I use one of these at home. This is, a time cube where I get distracted. I have kids that are oftentimes at home. I have, emails and notifications that pop up. And so I will take one of these and pick like, okay, I'm spending the next 15 minutes just doing this memo. And I will, decide like that timer is going to govern my time. Tools like that can help people focus. And so can neurotechnology, which can help reveal things to yourself that you don't even know, right? So I think I'm a morning person. I use the devices over a series of days and I discover not only am I not a morning person in terms of my focus and attention, but the time that I'm most productive, is from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. I can reorient my life in ways that are useful. When workplaces start to use that technology to impose it upon people, it undermines morale. It makes people more stressed because they feel like even their brains are being monitored. And it, I think, measures the wrong thing because long periods of focus and attention don't necessarily translate to a better bottom line for employers. Moments of mind wandering are critical for both reducing stress, but also making it like the kind of big insights generally come from those periods of mind wandering, not from, intense periods of focus and attention. So I think there's lots of reasons why it's a bad idea for employers to monitor brain activity, including attention and focus. And so what does that mean? It means if an employer is going to introduce neurotechnology into the workplace, they ought to do things like first, full and transparent disclosure. Like I'm giving you this technology and I'm not tracking the data that's coming from it, right? That's clearly stated in the handbook. Or if they are tracking it to make managerial level decisions, like we're trying to look at this in the aggregate to make decisions about whether work from home policies work or if they don't, or how to best fashion, kind of work in the office, work at home, or how to design an office space to make it less stressful for people. They also need to fully and transparently disclose how the data is being used and for what purpose. And so I think transparency, but smart workplace policies about how and whether neurotechnology is introduced into the workplace is absolutely essential. And the starting place for all of that goes back to the rights I was talking about. We have to start with a right to cognitive liberty, which means a right to mental privacy for workers. And employers, even if that right isn't adopted, should act as if it is and should respect the mental privacy of their employees if they want to create a culture in which there's trust, where there's morale, where there actually is high productivity because it's a high trust and high respect organization.
Well, I think that, my listeners are going to so appreciate you hearing about this because I'm so bullish on the technology. I'm so optimistic and just love the idea of neurotechnology, but fleshing out how this actually will be implemented in areas like the workplace, I think is just so important. I'm going to quote a couple of things from your book. We know that Control Labs was acquired by Facebook, NextMind acquired by Snapchat, Microsoft has an EEG patent, Apple hinting that they may integrate EEG into AirPods, hiring neuroscientists. I think that if an EarPod came out from Apple that had high fidelity EEG sensing, that would sort of put all this into immediate reality. And it might be a hard question to answer, but from your perspective, does it look like it's going to be a major tech company that comes out with a breakthrough BCI product? Is it going to be a company maybe that we haven't heard about, or is this going to be more subtle? For instance, I know LG has released some EEG earbuds that are not on the mass market right now, and maybe just using in specific communities. Emanate from Emotive is another example. From what you've seen, are you thinking it might be a big tech breakthrough from one of the major companies, or are we going to get more of a subtle integration of these technologies over time?
I think what's going to make it go mainstream is probably a major tech acquisition. And I say, like you mentioned, Emanate. I wouldn't be surprised if they're a hot target acquisition, right? So they're, here's one of the Emanates, right? So, this integrated with these makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, I thought Apple was going to acquire Control Labs. I was very surprised when it was Meta instead, just given that Apple was so far ahead on, the watch. And so integration of EMG into their watches made a lot of sense to me. So, I think EMG acquisition by Meta through, kind of Facebook and Reality Labs and bringing that mainstream together with earbuds from a company like Apple or, Google or other devices. I think that's what's going to normalize it. What's going to happen in the next couple of years? You're going to have a bunch of companies who are launching multifunctional devices, but I think are more led by the neurotech companies. So as Neurable, as I understand that they've partnered with a major headphones manufacturer, right? And so, if headphones like these hit the market and it's, Bose or Beats or kind of one of them, but they also have the opportunity for people to track focus and attention, I think that's going to start to normalize it. And then once you have one of the major tech companies launch with brain sensors integrated into one of their multifunctional devices, I think that's what takes it truly mainstream. So I think you're going to see some of the smaller ones and some of the leaders on the neurotech, consumer neurotech side launch, this May, this June. A lot of them are bringing their multifunctional devices to market. And then as soon as I think the Facebook or the Apple or the Microsoft or the Googles start to integrate it into theirs as well, I think it becomes mass market.
Yeah, someone asked at the World Economic Forum what your 1, 5, and 10-year prediction was. And I thought you had such a great answer. So I just have to ask you again for this program. And it had to do with the integration of these wearables and more data. Could you take us through the 1, 5, 10-year prediction?
Maybe you can prompt me. I don't remember exactly what I said there, but
well, what you said was so smart, because it was that these technologies are going to get integrated into headphones and be released over the next year. And that what happens is that you have very many more people using these technologies, which adds to the big data set, whether that be EEG, FNIRS, or whatever other sensors that they're using. And because of that, and because of advances in AI, you get much more powerful algorithms and more well-defined capabilities within the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, that was a smart answer. But I agree with that. What I wasn't thinking about as hard then, which I think really then maybe even is a faster time frame, is I wasn't thinking about layering generative AI on top of it. And so I've been talking with a lot of people over the past month about the ability of generative AI to customize applications and precision of brainwave data for individuals or FNIRS for individuals. And so if you think about that, right, generative AI is very good at being able to take each individual's data set, right? So you're wearing, EEG, FNIRS, whatever, over the next few months through your earbuds, and generative AI is trained on that data. It's still a huge amount of data, right? If you think about how much personal data can be collected against the huge data sets that are being collected by other people, that allows for both precision and customization, right? Your customized music track that's able to respond to your unique stress patterns and your unique brainwave data. So I think it's going to come even faster than I thought, to the extent that generative AI is married together with the technological and data advances that are going to happen. So by 5 years, I think we have not only much more powerful devices because they're trained on huge data sets that are collected across these, different devices that come to market and are used, but generative AI makes them much more customizable for the individual. It means that the experience for individuals in using the headsets becomes much more powerful as well. Like in that animation, I talked about, you're leaning back, suddenly, your favorite song comes on in response to your brainwave activity. That's so much more realistic in the world of generative AI as it responds to and customizes your experience in response to your brainwave or FNIRS data.
Yeah, I think that these advancements about, what you can actually get out of wearables with powerful data analytic systems is developing very fast. I mean, you have all these different companies at the high end. You have Brian Johnson's kernel that gets full head coverage. FNIRS is very expensive, but then you also have companies that
I don't think he's quite figured out the form factor yet. I don't see wearing a bike helmet in my everyday life. But again, you start with big, clunkier devices, you pick up much more powerful data, and the miniaturization comes. We've seen that from, your giant room filled with a computer down to, a handheld device that's so much more powerful than anything we ever had. So, yeah.
Well, I'm a physician, so I think about medical diagnostics in the clinic as well. I think that people would be more likely to wear a helmet in a clinic if it meant, analytics of brain data.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you one last question. People often make this distinction between wearables and implantables. Elon Musk's Neuralink and Synchron running clinical trials this year. Hopefully Neuralink doing as well.
Yeah.
When I think about these implantable technologies, the data seems just very localized to a small area of the brain, whereas with wearables, you have more full head coverage and more real-time data in real-world environments, in my opinion. Has the conversation changed at all from your perspective about implantables versus wearables, or do they all have a role to play?
Well, I mean, you're familiar with cognition, right? And I think when you start to look at wearables like that for therapeutic purposes that integrate AR with, broader coverage, it starts to close the gap for some people. You're still looking at the difference while it's localized between thousands of electrodes that don't have, hair and scalp that are interfering with the data. And so I do think we're talking about a difference in kind and not just in degree in some ways. What I hoped to accomplish with my book, right? The last chapter on Beyond Human, or second to last chapter on Beyond Human, does go into a lot of implanted technologies. And I do see a future in which, if it really did become incredibly safe and effective, we could imagine a future in which people are using implanted technology for healthy individuals. But, we have 40 people in the world who are using implanted, technology, whereas we could have millions to billions of people using wearable technology integrated into their everyday life. And while for the average person, you don't need the same fidelity of speech synthesis because you have the ability of communicating otherwise, the power of the technology to interact with our everyday technology, including text messaging and, sending communication directly from brain to communication, the applications in everyday life and the fidelity of that's going to get better and better. And I would imagine that as you have technology like cognition come to market and become more mainstream, there will be many, many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of patients for whom wearable brain technology will make a lot more sense than implanted technology. So from a medical and therapeutic application perspective, being able to enable a person with ALS with a headset rather than, brain surgery is really incredibly promising. So I think over time, for many neuroscientists, and especially for people who have been working on implanted neurotechnology for a very long time, again, I think a lot of them dismissed a lot of brain wearables and focused their effort and attention on implanted technology. We've learned so much, and we will continue to learn so much from implanted technology, but many of the learnings from that are transferable to wearable technology, maybe for different applications. But we learn from that high fidelity information, train our algorithms on lower fidelity or, different electrode placement on the scalp. And that's how a lot of the focus and attention, for example, algorithms have been trained. Is you take medical grade EEG, you relate it to, earbuds, and you find that you can extract signals that are sufficient to train algorithms on in-ear EEG to give you, much of the same functionality. So I think we're going to see a closing of the gap over time, even though for some applications and for some patients, implanted technology is going to become the better option rather than wearable technology. But it just makes it so much more accessible to such a wider population of people, and so much less risky, right, for a wider population of individuals that, it's just, I think people are starting to and will continue to take wearable brain technology so much more seriously than they did in the past.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you fleshing out the nuances of how that's going to be implemented, but also just capturing everything that's going on in the industry. I so enjoyed reading your book, and I really wish you luck on the release next month.
Thank you. Thanks.
Really enjoyed it. And I wanted to ask, what does the next month or two look like for you in terms of the release? Any big media appearances or anything exciting coming up?
Yeah, a lot. So there's going to be a ton of media. There are quite a few book reviews that are coming out. There's a lot of appearances that I have in various venues, from places like South by Southwest on March 13th to TED in April, to Aspen Ideas Festival in June, to City Arts and Lecture in San Francisco. So a lot of very large venues, which is something I'm incredibly excited about, because part of the reason that I wrote this book in the way that I did, with a trade publisher rather than an academic press, for example, and the reason that I've been engaging with media so much about it, is I think it's so important for the general public to start to become educated about what's happening with consumer wearables, and particularly consumer brain sensors and wearables, and how to be part of the conversation and how to help advance the technology in ways that benefit humanity. Because I think it's here, right? It has arrived. And how it's rolled out in society, how it will benefit humanity, how we can make it work for people in ways that are empowering rather than impressive, that's all in the hands of ordinary people, right? And the more educated they become about it, the more likely it goes in a direction that we're comfortable with, that we celebrate rather than cringe or fear.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for your time, Nita.
Thank you.